The winter had already taken more from her than any season ever should, and as the wind slid down the mountains like a blade and cut through her thin shawl, Eliza Boone finally understood what it meant to be truly alone. Not the kind of loneliness that comes from silence, but the kind that presses on the chest until every breath feels borrowed, because there was no one left in the world who would call her name if she disappeared into the snow that night. No mother waiting by a fire, no father pacing a floor, no brother riding out at dawn, only the vast, merciless wilderness stretching in every direction, white and endless, swallowing sound and hope the same way it swallowed footprints, tracing proof that anyone had ever passed this way at all. Just 3 months earlier she had still been a daughter, a sister, a wife in all but name, living in a small valley settlement where people smiled even when times were hard, where laughter still rose above the crack of wood and the lowing of cattle, but sickness came quietly, riding in on a trader's wagon, and within weeks the valley graveyard grew crowded. Her parents first, then her younger brother, then the man she was meant to marry, taken one by one until she was the last Boone standing, packing what little she could, carry and walking away from a place that now echoed with ghosts. She told herself she was heading east, toward towns, toward people, but the mountains had other plans. Storms closing passes, wolves stalking the weak, hunger making her hands shake as she rationed the last of her bread. And when the snow came heavy and sudden, she lost the trail and wandered until her legs gave out, collapsing near a frozen creek where the cold crept into her bones like something alive. She might have died there, curled into herself and whispering apologies to no one, if the sound of boots crunching through snow hadn't reached her ears, slow and steady, not hurried, not panicked. The sound of a man who knew this land and feared nothing it threw at him. She tried to lift her head, but darkness pressed in, and when she woke again, warmth shocked her senses so violently that she gasped, coughing as smoke stung her throat, her eyes fluttering open to firelight dancing across rough-hewn logs, the scent of pine and cooked meat filling the air, and before fear could rise, strong arms wrapped around her from behind, firm and protective, holding her steady as she shook uncontrollably. The man didn't speak at first, didn't demand answers or explanations, just held her as if he understood that words would shatter her, and when he finally did speak his voice was low and calm, deep as the forest itself, telling her she was safe now, that the storm couldn't reach her here, that she could rest. He was a mountain man, broad-shouldered, wrapped in worn buckskin and fur, his beard thick with frost when he first brought her in, eyes sharp but not cruel, the eyes of someone who had seen death often enough to respect life when it appeared fragile in his arms. His cabin stood alone in a clearing miles from any settlement, smoke curling from the chimney like a promise against the cold, and as Eliza sat there wrapped in blankets staring at the fire, she realized how close she had come to vanishing without witness, how easily the world would have moved on without ever knowing her name. He gave her broth slow sips, watching carefully to be sure she didn't choke, and when tears spilled down her cheeks she couldn't stop them. Grief pouring out of her in broken sobs she had held back for weeks, her hands clutching at his sleeves like a child afraid of being abandoned again. He let her cry, let her lean into him, his arms closing around her shoulders in a way that felt impossibly safe, as if the mountains themselves had decided to shelter her through this man. When she finally found her voice, it came out small and cracked, telling him she had no one left, nowhere to go, that she didn't even know why she kept walking when everything she loved was buried under frozen ground. He listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening not with impatience, but with something like anger at a world that could strip someone down so completely. And when she finished, expecting pity or obligation, he surprised her by simply saying she could stay until she was strong again, that no one deserved to face winter alone, not on these mountains and not in this life. Days passed, measured by firelight and the slow return of strength to her limbs, and each morning she woke half expecting him to be gone, the cabin empty, the warmth a dream. But he was always there, splitting wood, checking traps, humming low tuneless sounds that felt like comfort itself. He never touched her without reason, never crossed a line. Yet when nightmares took her in the night and she cried out, he would sit beside her pallet and place a steady hand on her shoulder, grounding her back in the present. She learned his name was Caleb Ridgway, a man who had left towns and people behind years ago after loss of his own, though he never spoke details. Only that the mountains were quieter, honest in their danger, and that solitude was easier than remembering. Eliza saw then that this man who had saved her was not untouched by pain, only shaped by it, carrying it like an old scar that ached in cold weather but no longer bled. As the storm eased and sunlight returned to the clearing, something fragile began to grow inside her. Not hope yet, but the idea that perhaps her story was not finished, that perhaps being found in the snow by a stranger was not the end but the beginning of something she could not yet name. And as she watched Caleb move through his cabin with quiet purpose, she felt a pull she did not understand, a sense that the arms that had held her back from death might be the only place in the world where she truly belonged, though she did not yet dare to believe it, not after losing everything once before. If you're still listening to this story, if this moment has reached you, remember to subscribe to the channel, because stories like Eliza's and Caleb's are just beginning, and the mountains still have much to reveal. When the snow finally loosened, its grip on the mountains and the silence softened into something almost gentle, Eliza realized that survival was no longer her only task, because living required more courage than simply staying alive. And as she moved through the cabin in those early days of spring, helping Caleb mend nets, clean hides, and tend the small patch of stubborn earth behind the cabin, she felt the weight of choice settling on her shoulders, the terrifying freedom of knowing she could leave if she wished, and the even more terrifying truth that she did not want to. Caleb never asked her to stay, never hinted that he needed her there, and that restraint meant more to her than any promise could have, because it told her he saw her not as something broken to be kept, but as a woman who deserved to decide her own fate. Yet the mountains were not done testing them, and neither was the past, because one afternoon as the sky darkened and the wind shifted with warning in its breath, riders appeared at the edge of the clearing. 3 men, hard-faced and hungry-looking, the kind that followed trails of weakness and called it opportunity, their eyes locking on the cabin and then on Eliza standing in the doorway, fear flashing through her before she could hide it. Caleb stepped forward without hesitation, placing himself between her and the strangers, his posture calm but unmistakably dangerous. A man who knew exactly what violence cost and was willing to pay the price if forced. Words were exchanged, sharp and probing, the riders asking questions that sounded harmless but carried threat beneath them, and Eliza felt the old helplessness claw at her chest, the memory of losing everything rising like a tide, until Caleb's arm moved back, wrapping around her shoulders in a silent, grounding promise that she was not facing this alone. The riders eventually left, unsettled by the mountain man's unblinking stare and the rifle resting easily in his hands, but their visit shattered the fragile peace, reminding Eliza that the world beyond the trees was still cruel and that safety was never permanent. That night she could not sleep, her thoughts racing, and when she finally spoke, her voice trembled as she told Caleb she did not want to be the reason danger came to his door, that she could not survive losing someone else because of her presence. Caleb listened as he always did, then told her something he had never said before, that he had lived alone not because he feared the world, but because he feared caring again, because the last time he loved, he buried a wife and a child beneath the same mountains that now sheltered them, and solitude had seemed easier than risking that kind of pain twice. His words did not push her away but drew her closer, because in his confession she saw her own wounds reflected, and when he pulled her into his arms, not as a rescuer but as a man reaching for connection, she understood that they were not filling each other's emptiness but standing together with it. Days turned into weeks and Eliza grew stronger, not just in body but in spirit, learning the rhythms of the land, the signs of weather, the quiet language of survival. Caleb spoke fluently, and with each shared task, each shared silence, the space between them grew smaller, filled with trust rather than fear. When the riders returned, this time with intent bared and weapons drawn, they found not a lonely mountain man and a fragile woman, but 2 people bound by choice, standing back to back in defense of the life they had built. And the confrontation ended swiftly, decisively, the mountains bearing witness to a truth as old as time, that strength multiplies when shared. Afterward, as dusk settled and the cabin glowed warm against the encroaching dark, Eliza leaned into Caleb's embrace, not because she needed saving, but because she wanted to be there. And as his arms wrapped around her, steady and sure, she felt something settle inside her at last, a quiet certainty that home was not a place she had lost, but one she was choosing to build. She knew the road ahead would not be easy, that grief would still surface, that the mountains would still demand respect and sacrifice, but she also knew she would not walk that road alone. and that knowledge was more powerful than any shelter. As the fire crackled and the wind whispered through the pines, Eliza rested her head against Caleb's chest and allowed herself to believe in tomorrow. And if this story has carried you this far, if it has wrapped its arms around you the way the mountain man wrapped his arms around her, then remember to subscribe to the channel, because every new story is a reminder that even after everything is lost, something worth holding on to can still be found.